Okay, so you say no. Please.
Yeah.
So we're going to hear some interesting talk from Stefan and Christian. Stefan is a PI, Hamburg economist, doing a lot of quantitative work together with Christian, and we are missing this angle of quantitative analysis of study, and we hope that he will fill this gap. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Ebi. It's actually Christian who will talk, and I had told you already, he will be very time constrained. So don't worry or don't wonder if he runs away around 5 to 11 or something, or 5 to 12 your time, I assume, because he needs to catch a bus to go to Copenhagen this afternoon. So Christian, floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks for having us. I will try to see if I can share my screen with you. Let's see if we can get this going. So our talk here is basically about trying to provide a framework and trying to give some examples of how to deal with this empirically. We can talk for weeks about cascading emergencies and how to think about them. But at the end of the day, we have to get a sense of exactly how big of a problem we're talking about and to what extent are cascading emergencies different from just one-off emergencies. So we're going to think theoretically about this concept and provide some empirics. A lot of it is based on a book that came out finally at the end of last year called State of Emergency. The book is more or less a collection of papers that have been rewritten to a book, and then we filled in with, I guess, 4 new chapters here and there. Now, we have 2 complications first in defining cascading emergencies. I was at an event in Zurich in December with John Yu from Berkeley. John is a professor of, I guess, of constitutional law there. And we had a chat that we don't really have a good definition about what an emergency actually is. So we use the term, and sometimes we use the term in a very broad way. So we conceptually stretch the term to claim that climate change is an emergency, even though it's something that changes over decades. John's point was, when we talk about these things, we need to be somehow clear about what is an emergency, first of all. If you look at the dictionaries, Oxford says it's a serious, unexpected, and often dangerous situation requiring immediate action. Merriam-Webster calls it an unforeseen combination of circumstances or the resulting state that calls for immediate action. They're actually problematic in themselves, those definitions, even though they might seem reasonable, because Oxford, for example, says it's a serious, unexpected, and often dangerous situation. And then it draws a conclusion. So it's going to be Oxford and Merriam-Webster defines it functionally as something that requires a particular political action. We very often, we do discuss that in a book. We very often see situations where we obviously have an emergency, but at a political level, we have absolutely no way of dealing with it. So an emergency can't be something that requires immediate action, because then you've actually put the cart before the horse and said that this is only an emergency if we can do something. We think of this as a serious, unexpected, and potentially dangerous situation. So what is a cascade? Well, a cascade has to be a series of emergencies that must somehow be associated with each other. So they might be directly causally associated with each other, or they might have a common source. For example, the discussion you just had, an earthquake that also causes a pandemic because the hospital system breaks down. That's a common cause, the earthquake. But we have to ask, how long between events do we allow? So we have emergency 1 and emergency 2 here. How long between 1 and 2 do we allow before we stop calling it a cascading emergency? So essentially, we need to have a discussion about the length of time here. I don't have a clear answer. You might claim, well, it has to be causal. So the causality requirement gives you a sense of the time between events within a cascading emergency. But this is something that we simply say, well, we kind of say this is cascading emergency because we feel it makes sense, but it's pretty undefined what we do. Second is, how do we distinguish a cascade from an ongoing conflict? So if you think about terrorism, you can have terrorism cascades, and we do see terrorism cascades quite a lot. However, would you say it's a cascading emergency if we have a number of terrorist attacks perpetrated by the same organization? We think we should call that an ongoing conflict and not a cascading emergency, because they are not separable events anymore. If you have a situation with multiple terrorist attacks perpetrated by different organizations that are not coordinated, then you can call it a cascading terrorist emergency, but not before. So the point here is we have to be very, very serious about defining our terms before we do anything. So what are they? Well, we can think of them as a single unified event. They're separate events, but which form a single unified event in which several extreme conditions occur in relatively rapid succession. We then need to basically accept that we haven't defined an emergency. We need to accept that the proof of the pudding is in the eating, that, well, we know kind of what an emergency is. That means that terrorist attacks are known to sometimes cascade. Some of my own research with Martin Rohde at the University of Nevada also suggests that coups sometimes cascade. So here's our framework. We think of a first event here, something that starts off the cascade. It might be a natural disaster. In this example we just had, it was an earthquake that, of course, starts off some kind of problem. That leads to a pandemic because of that problem. But it could also be a terrorist attack. It could also be a coup attempt that might succeed, might not succeed. It could be a fourth type of emergency. In order for that to cascade, you either have to have weaker government or weaker state institutions. That would what's happened in the example where an earthquake leads to a pandemic through this weakening of the hospitals. It might also just be a perception of weaker government or weaker state institutions. So a terrorist attack reveals information that a given state doesn't really have the means or perhaps the willingness to deal with a terrorist attack. That would be an incentive for other organizations to attempt new terrorist attacks. So that is not solid information. That would more be a perception of either having a weaker government or weaker state institutions. That can also then lead to new terrorist attacks. It can also lead to general strikes, because fundamentally different types of organizations will react to the information that the government is weaker. It might lead to a coup attempt, which I'm going to give you an example of in a bit. But this is our framework here. And of course, then the coup attempt might lead to weaker government institutions that might, again, lead to a terrorist attack. So you can have very simple cascading emergencies. You can have very complex cascading emergencies in which different types of events occur in rapid succession. But this is basically our framework here. And it's a framework where there is something that we can't always observe. That's a perception of weaker government or state institution. Sometimes you actually get case studies where the actors involved in these events tell you that it was clear that the government was weak. But it's not very clearly observable. But what we can observe is the series of events. So here's some evidence from our chapter 7 here of what kinds of events we're talking about. The chapter in our emergency book is about states of emergency after domestic turmoil. It actually explores the quite overlooked question of when governments call a state emergency following something like general strikes or coups or insurgencies. That's not terrorist attacks and not natural disasters. The complicating thing, also from an empirical point of view here, is that these are endogenous events. They do not happen at random. Great thing about natural disasters is they do happen at random. We know that some areas are more prone to natural disasters than others. But given that, when these natural disasters happen is exogenous. When coup attempts happen, when general strikes happen, are not. So that really complicates things from an empirical point of view. So you have to think about when do these things happen, and then when do governments call a state of emergency to officially declare we're in a state of emergency. Now we have a few, in about a data of about 850 states of emergency, we have a few that are declared based on an alleged coup. Note that an alleged coup is that the government itself claims that there was a coup, but there's no outside information verifying that claim. Might be a political event. The government might actually just lose the majority in parliament and then declare state emergency. It might be after coups that we can actually verify. Very often what happens is that a coup attempt occurs and succeeds, and the new government immediately calls a state of emergency. In that case, we have the complication that calling the state of emergency is a way of coup-proofing the brand new regime. So that the actual declaration of a state of emergency here may actually prevent a cascading emergency. Or it might suggest that the government is in such a bad shape that they have to declare an emergency in order to try to survive. In that case, the declaration might actually be a signal that you might get a cascading emergency. We don't know which one it is in general. Now, you have a lot of emergencies declared after demonstrations and protests. They're almost all violent, but those are general strikes, for example. After civil wars, of course, after major riots, and then the surprising thing is we get, I think it's 88 cases where there is no clear event that leads to a state of emergency. Now, we should remember that in some cases, this is just a government that becomes autocratic. In some cases, these are emergencies that happen because of some actual event that is just not reported. Again, of course, that really complicates things. So we have several different potential reasons, all of which might lead to cascades. But the actual chance that you get a declaration, an official recognition that there is an emergency, varies a lot depending on the types. And of course, the main problem is the unknown ones are very common. So here is one of them. This comes out from studying coups and conflicts. This is also in the book. Note here that SOE declarations are much more likely after coup cascades and multiple or increasing conflicts. So if you have a period over a few years where you have either multiple coups here is actually more than one coup within a calendar year or 12 months. But also if you have a lot of general strikes or riots and so on in rapid succession, this is much more likely for a government to lead to a declaration of state emergency. So this is our first little bit of empirical suggestions that these events are different because governments very, very clearly react differently to them. And it's both coups to some extent, but very, very clearly also these lower level social conflicts like general strikes or riots. How common is this problem? Well, this is cascading terrorism. As you can see, you kind of have a 50-50% chance over sort of the rich world of having a year with at least one terrorist attack. What happens is here that given that if you have a year without a terrorist attack, fine. If you do get attacks, as you can see here, in about 20% of these cases, there's only one attack per year. But it also means that in 30% of the cases here where you get at least one attack in a modern or rich country, you're going to get more than one. So some of these are cascades. And basically, 30% of the years in which we see terrorism, we see something that might be a cascade. So this is one of the things we want to do here with this talk, show you that this is just if you look at terrorism, this is properly a common event. Looking down here, you get about 20% of all years where you have up to 10 terrorist attacks per year. Quite often, the typical thing is that these terrorist attacks happen either in the capital or in one of the largest cities. So it's not the case that you have 3 terrorist attacks, one in Washington, D.C., one in Houston, and one in Bowling Green, Ohio. They are concentrated geographically, which means that they are similar. If you had a large country with terrorist attacks all over the country, it would be much more difficult to claim that these are cascades. But given that they typically are concentrated in either the largest city or the few largest cities, we can be pretty clear that this is a common phenomenon in the terrorist literature, and it's really not been studied. So what are these events? Well, some distinction here, as I said, events can be spread geographically. That means that it's going to be more difficult to claim that these are cascades. They're also always spread over a limited period of time. Otherwise, we can't claim they're cascades. But most importantly, these are a priori unlikely to be repeat events. So basically, you can't claim that Hamas blowing up a bomb in Tel Aviv 1 week and then Hamas blowing up a bomb in Tel Aviv 2 weeks later is a cascade. It's an ongoing conflict and therefore a repeat event. And we think of repeat events as different from cascades. Now we think...
No, recurring. Yes. Recurring. We call them recurring because the vulnerability is still there. If the vulnerability is still there, fires can recur, terrorist attacks can recur. It's just they exploit the vulnerability again and again.
Can I ask a question for, are these events a declared emergency terror attacks, or you are not differentiate between even not a single silo emergency and just a terror attack that is not an emergency?
We are not coding these based on whether there is a declaration or not.
The events.
It's events, not
events. Yeah, these are events.
Yeah. I'd be very happy with calling them recurring events. The only thing here is to note that there are, whether we call repeat or recurring events, they are different from cascades.
Of course. Yeah, we agree.
Yeah.
What's your database here?
We currently have a database of about 850 events that qualify or a priori qualify as states of emergencies. And most of our work has been looking at whether or not the government declares a state of emergency around these events. And of course, also then what do these states of emergencies then lead to? Do they help? And a lot of our time and effort has been spent on trying to get a sense of what does the Constitution allow a government to do once it's declared a state of emergency.
Yeah.
So
we agree also. We understand the logic. Sometimes it's worth it to declare, sometimes it's not worth it to declare. Yeah. Provided that the three conditions of emergencies are met, that there is
threat and all that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, but just note that what Stefan and I did with Mehdi Kasali was a paper in, I think it was in Journal of Legal Studies, on unlawful emergencies. So we do have a fair share of emergencies that are declared without a constitutionally sanctioned event.
Yes.
So that's important. Legitimate and non-legitimate. That's the GLS paper.
Yeah. So, yeah. So basically, I mean, these are events that would qualify as emergencies, but not necessarily events that lead to a declaration of any kind. So.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm sorry about the misspelling here. We think of a cascade as constituting several events led by different factions, either lead or non-lead. Some of these events, the first event might be a natural disaster, of course. So that's not led by a different faction. But essentially, the remaining events in a cascade will have to be in some way political events. Coups, strikes, terrorist attacks, and so on. And what we do is we try to get closer to a definition, also an operational definition in an empirical sense, by saying they have to be led by different factions. Otherwise, they are what you might call recurring events. Or we here claim that, well, if the events are led by the same actor, they're better thought of as an ongoing conflict.
Yeah.
And then you have an entire different literature and peace research on ongoing conflicts.
Agreed.
Now, one very clear thing is my ongoing work with Martin Rode. Martin is professor at the University of Nevada. Martin and I have built a large database on what we think is pretty much all coup attempts since 1950. So we have right now 570 events in the data set. We find actually 76 coup cascades since 1950, only defining these in terms of coups that follow coups in rapid succession. So you could have coups that are followed by terrorist attacks or vice versa, and so on. Now, the thing with these is that a priori, what they do is that reveal political instability. The political instability might have been there before and led to a coup. the thing here is that once you have a coup cascade, what you almost always have is a situation where the actual events reveal the existence of competing factions, either within the established elite or associated with the political elite. So this is actually comes out of our definition here that cascades have to be led by different actors. And in this particular situation, what you can see by looking at the actual data, these 76 cascades here, is that when you have multiple different factions that are able to stage a coup, then what you have is a very different political situation behind the cascade. Now, what we find is, in general, these coup cascades are not different from single-off coups. That might not be the case with other coup emergencies, cascading emergencies. But exactly with coup cascades, they are not more likely to lead to a worsening of freedom of expression or the rule of law or more corruption or anything like that. They're not more likely to lead to major economic problems. However, what they are, which we think of as probably the most important and most interesting thing, is that coup cascades are more likely to result in democracy than single coup events. And actually substantially more likely. After 2 years, the difference is a 50% difference. So this is just one example of where you might say that you have a cascading emergency, but the consequences of the cascading emergency are not necessarily bad. I don't think any of us would claim that a much higher chance of demoralization is bad, right? But this comes out of the revelation of the background situation that comes out of having a cascade. Might not be the cascade per se, but it does tell us something empirically about what's going to happen.
So again, in our terminology, this would relate to vulnerabilities, right? This are we, for the literature that we found. Yes.
Yeah.
By definition, do coups only occur in non-democratic countries?
No, they don't. I mean, the most likely, the most recent coup attempt we have was from South Korea.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
The three last ones are South Korea, Peru, and Ecuador, I think. They're all democracies, and they are a common cause of autocratization. These coups. Now, this is one example here. It's Brazil in 1963 and 64. And it actually begins all the way back in 1962 when the elected president, João Goulart, reintroduced presidentialism. So actually forced through a constitutional amendment allocating much more power to the president after a situation where a number of years where Brazil was a democracy, with a president, but an almost purely ceremonial president. So basically a democracy like Germany today. He reintroduced presidentialization, got that voted through parliament. There were persistent rumors of a planned autogolpe, so a coup that would give Goulart the entire executive power. That results in as a part of what results in the Sergeant's Revolt on the 12th of September 1963, which is a major revolt among sergeants in the military and in the Navy. Part of it is because the Supreme Court confirms that military personnel is not eligible for election, but most of it is a reaction against the president and his constitutional amendments. Now that is fought down and dies. It's treated very peacefully by the authorities. But the situation remains unresolved to the extent that a couple of parties leave the government. Eventually, at the end of March 1964, the entire thing starts again with the Sailors' Revolt, which is a major revolt in the Navy for the pretty much exact same reasons. That revolt gets resolved 4 days later when 2 generals and a field marshal simply topple the democratic government. It ends 18 years of democracy, introduces 22 years of military dictatorship. We get to 1985 before the military starts re-demoralization in Brazil. This is one of our examples of a coup cascade. It starts actually with a military revolt, which is not a coup attempt. The Sailors' Revolt is explicitly a coup attempt within a military revolt, which gets resolved by a successful coup. So this is a cascading emergency. And the interesting thing here is, from an emergency perspective, that after the Sergeants' Revolt, Goulart actually tries to push Parliament to declare an official state of emergency, which Parliament doesn't do. But the president, in the very first case, is ready to declare state of emergency. So from the very beginning, this is called an emergency in Brazilian politics. This is obviously a bad end somehow, but it is one of these kinds of events where something that's not one type becomes another type, which apparently, when you look at the data, seems to be the normal case. But this, looking at the data, trying to code up when do you have cascades, when don't you have cascades, is not straightforward. But it raises a number of questions. First of all, what triggers cascades? Are they random occurrences?
Just a question. So in our terminology, if it's a single silo, so that if it's a coup after a coup after a coup, and it exploits the very same vulnerability, which is within the political system, there is instability. And the coup, we differentiate this from multiple silos. That is, a coup that is then related to the healthcare system or some others. Because from an analytical perspective, we would expect that if there is a political vulnerability, this recurring attempt to reform the system, to change the system, will happen, whether by the same person or by a different person. So we have to talk within the group, and of course with you as well, as part of the group, whether to think about it particularly as cascading or a kind of a single silo event that is unique because it goes to the different end of the political spectrum. One is pro-democracy, one is anti-democracy, doesn't matter. But it's of the same kind, of the same essence. This is just a comment from an analytical perspective, because we think that if there is a coup that then relates to an emergency crisis, again, in the healthcare system, or something, it's of a different kind.
Yeah, I tend to disagree. I don't think that the silo way of thinking is really that helpful. It's a way of thinking about, in our terms here, do you have a cascade, the coup? Do you have a general strike? Do you have a revolt? They are different ways of reacting to the same. As economists, we are trained in thinking about actors. And to me, the important thing is not how the event occurs, but whether or not it's different actors that trigger these events.
Yes, no, but what we're saying we say that there is a political vulnerability, okay?
There might be. That's why, basically, why I emphasize that this is perceived weakness. It need not be true.
Agreed. There is a true vulnerability or a perceived vulnerability. I take your point, that is correct. And then we would expect there to be a coup after a coup after a coup. We wouldn't call it cascading. We would say that there is an ongoing, recurring, or repeating emergency or events or stress or coup. It so happens that I'm just talking about the previous Brazilian case, which you think of as cascading, but from
one becomes complex.
The degree of complexity or the degree of stress of the system increases. But we wonder whether it is helpful to think about it in terms of cascading. It's exactly the same thing as you would have another fire in California and then another fire in California, but in a different area in California, still in California, because the vulnerability with fires in California is not fixed. It's there. It's a condition.
Yeah. The thing is, if you insist on the silo metaphor, and you say these are not, it's not a cascade, then we have no word for what is a series of events in which different actors attempt a coup, or different actors attempt to affect political power in different ways in rapid succession.
Agreed. So let us agree that if you have a single silo, it makes a difference whether it's a coup or a strike. I agree with you that we can differentiate. In single silo studies, we should be able to have different terminology to differentiate a coup attempt from a general strike. Definitely terror attack is a different silo because this is war and belligerency. So that's a different silo. And natural disaster is a different silo, so that's fine. Between a coup and a general strike, we might need to differentiate, but again, the language of cascading invokes something more in our language, something that it is outside the socio-political, or if you're in the war area, it's outside the war and belligerencies. This is what we're missing, because when we use a terminology that doesn't differentiate between silos, you miss. So silos usually are, the reason we call them silos is we perceive them as something completely different. So we treat natural disaster as different than wars and belligerencies. The legal paradigm is different.
The legal and political.
The political paradigm.
All of their examples are man-made emergencies, which, for example, in constitutional terms, raises the question of the political legitimacy of the community, of the demos. And in natural-made disaster, the political and moral effect is the opposite. It is really around the flag effects and so on and so forth. So, for example, we need to account for that. Most of Stefan and Christian's example are man-made. In the cascading literature, I think most of the emphasis is on nature-made disaster and then their cascading effect. But as Christian said, eventually within a cascade, we will see an interaction between man-made and...
And this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for this interaction between either two different man-made, to the extent that it's there, but of a totally different kind, like war, which is man-made, and political crisis, which is also human-made, or natural and, either political or... So I'm looking for this kind of cross-silo for the cascading issue to kick in. But again, this is a conversation we're not set, we're still in the process of thinking about it, precisely for the reasons, Christian, you said, that definitions are so important. And we don't want to undermine the potential difference difference between a strike and a coup that is happening through the military, but not through. But it seems to us to be.
Let me just stop you. 25% of all coups since 1950 have not been military.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, no. So I'm not undermining this, but I'm saying, okay, so coups are still the category of coups, and within coups, we can talk about the different type of coups that are, and the difference is important. I agree, but to us, it seems that the difference between a coup, regardless of whether it's a coup of one kind or a coup of another kind, and the threat of a natural disaster or the perception of, or the meaning, the social meaning of a natural disaster or the social meaning of war is dramatically different, and we don't want to lump all this cascading together. It's a different kind of cascading. This is what I'm trying to get at. But we can continue.
I think, I don't know about Stefan, but I don't think that the silo metaphor is helpful here.
Okay, so we can continue the conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
Christian, another question. Do you consider an attempt of regime change by elected government as a coup? You know, we call what the government, Israeli government, is trying to do in the last 2 years as an attempt, coup attempt. Is this included in your? So this is something that we also have to discuss.
Yeah.
You know, whether Orban or Trump should be considered as a coup attempt.
Yeah, we don't think that. I mean, the usual definition of a coup attempt is an event that lasts up to a week. They're very sharply defined short events. So undermining the constitutional order can be very long-term projects, like Trump apparently has and Orban obviously has, but they're not coups. They might lead to the same consequences, but they're not coups. They're different events.
Okay, so we need
to also a point for this.
It's a point for discussion. What counts? So again, definitions matter here. But Stephanie, you want to say something about Brazil?
Oh,
people.
Oh, hi. I don't know if I agree with the idea of the cascading coup in the Brazilian case, because the proportion is totally different. The sailors' revolt do not lead to the military coup. It's something so much smaller, and the military coup has another proportion. So, in my point of view, one thing do not lead to another. I think that is important, but it's something very small comparing to what happened in the national contest. I don't know if I was clear.
You didn't.
Isn't necessarily a disaster.
No, for me, cascading, it's linear, and the sailors' revolt do not lead to the military coup.
That's a good point. That's a good point. We don't necessarily think of these as linear, in terms causally linear. Absolutely not.
Okay.
Our point is that the three events have basically common causes, and then you get multiple events for a common reason, more or less, but they are not causally linearly associated. That's right. That's a very good point.
Just want to get this clear. So if there is, I'm trying to think of a counterexample. So if there is a political vulnerability in a certain, let's say Lebanon, whatever, let's say a country has some political instability or perceived instability, you would expect, I think, a recurring attempts to exploit their vulnerability one way or the other, either one leading to another or unrelated but coming from the same vulnerability. In fact, if there is this kind of vulnerability, it would be weird if there wouldn't be these recurring attempts to, let's say, Greece at a certain point in time had it wasn't particularly a coup, but there was such instability that the government could not complete more than whatever very few months. It would just be an ongoing instability.
Maybe if I can, just one minor remark on this discussion. So Christian has been using the term political instability or perceived weakness of government, whereas you, Amnon, are focusing on vulnerability. And it might be useful to clearly keep these concepts apart. At least I don't know what you've been discussing yesterday, but my hunch when I hear the word vulnerability is that I think basically of the members of society as a whole. Society is vulnerable to a pandemic if many of its members can get sick. Okay, but that is so in essence these are not synonymous. They describe different things, and it might be useful to be very clear about, are we talking about a perceived weakness of government or political instability? And that is basically, if you remember the causal chain slide that Christian presented a minute ago, that is basically our sort of, if you want, our theory behind the whole behind the whole argument that if there is an event that, no matter if it's a natural disaster or a man-made event, that in a sense documents the weakness of government, this might lead and now to more man-made disasters, to additional domestic turmoil. Obviously not to natural disasters. They don't react to this because they are exogenous, as Christian was saying. So that's the logic. So in a sense it makes sense. If you're interested in that logic, it makes a lot of sense to concentrate on man-made events because natural disasters are exogenous. You can talk about the consequences of natural disasters on humans, and then you're back to the vulnerability stuff. I hope that was helpful.
We see your point, but the way we think about it now, and again, we're in the process of. You should be. We need you here also physically present for this conversation. But the way we talked about it also yesterday is we use so there's a weakness of society as a whole, or vulnerability of society as a whole, but we situate the vulnerability in a social system. It could be a political vulnerability. It could be a market-based vulnerability. It could be a vulnerability in law, which is different. So we use the Lumanian idea of system theory to explain society as well, and we situate particular vulnerabilities. And of course, if there's a vulnerability in the market, the entire society is vulnerable. So if the system is dependent on production chains that are external to it, it's more vulnerable to certain type of emergencies that may occur. So we are exogenous we are indifferent to the question of, at a certain point, of course, the government is expected to deal with vulnerability in any system, but we think this is not, it doesn't capture the true, at least the literature that we identified on vulnerabilities, which is why we use this term, situate vulnerabilities in particular context of social systems. And then, if there's a vulnerability in the political system, in the system of politics, then we get what we get. But we understand that there's more conversation that has to go on in order to, and then the logic will be, again, I accept, Stefan, your point about logic, but if you have a problem in this, so the bureaucracy is a system, if you have a problem in the healthcare system, you will have a recurring something in the, it will keep, so the viruses will keep coming. If you don't, people are not inoculated, you will have an ongoing, again and again, emergencies or crises or what have you. And the same is with fire. So the government is also responsible to deal with fire exogenously, but if the government is weak or can't deal with it, or you will have, again, a recurring problem of natural disaster, because even though it's exogenous, what we care about is the main response to that, or the action, or...
Can I just echo Stefan here? I think part of this is also because we're both from a public choice tradition within the social sciences. So from the 1950s and well into the 1980s, Italy was very, very politically unstable.
Mm-hmm.
However, society as a whole was not vulnerable. You can also think of Sudan under al-Bashir. It was a politically very, very stable society, but in almost any other sense, a highly vulnerable society. I think if you're thinking about political vulnerability and societal vulnerability as somehow positively correlated, you're going to get things wrong. In many cases here, societal vulnerability is helped by political instability, because politicians do not always do the right thing. And actually, I should stress in our 2021 paper on public choice on natural disasters, we find that the more power the emergency provisions allocate to the executive during emergencies, the more people die after natural disasters, because governments systematically misuse their emergency powers.
This I can see.
So basically, if you're thinking about political instability and vulnerability as kind of parts of the same concept, you are likely to get a lot of things wrong, because you're making assumptions about government behavior.
If you focus on governments, we are likely to get things wrong, but we don't necessarily focus on governments. So your chain of logic requires there to be a government weakness or a government this or a government that, because you focus on political choices related to government, which is okay. But we are focusing on society and systems. And so politics, including government, is one of the players. Doctors are others. And, you know, public participation in it, it's another. So we view it differently, and we still have to think how to bridge our conversation so that vulnerabilities, the term vulnerability that, again, we took from the literature, and we agree that there is something about overall societal vulnerability, but the literature we found focuses on system vulnerability. So we have to keep the conversation going, is what I'm saying. We have to see what, because if, the only question that worries me now is the definition of cascading.
Yeah.
I agree with the gist of what you're saying, the normative gist and the institutional gist of what you're saying. I completely agree and I get it. It's just a question of how to study cascading, which I see differently. But again, we should continue the conversation.
Yeah. So I'm at the end of my our presentation here. Well, our questions here, first of all, are cascades random occurrences? So are there reasons for why one event becomes a cascade and another event does not? And honestly, we don't know.
Yes, this is wonderful. This is exactly where we are.
Yeah. But coding them up allows us to at least estimate the chance of having cascade, given that there is some emergency. Second, do institutions and policies matter more? So the big conclusion from our emergency book is that emergency provisions are systematically misused. So in that sense, constitutional institutions do matter. But in a non-trivial way. But we don't know whether that is also the case once things cascade. Does it matter that whether or not you declare an emergency? We touched upon that a bit earlier. Might not matter, actually. In a lot of our empirical studies, we find that constitutions do have consequences, but it seems not to be important whether the government has declared an emergency or not. Mm-hmm. Do cascades become increasingly violent? We don't know. But again, once you have coded these things up, there is at least a fighting chance of estimating whether these cascades become increasingly violent. We have examples of it. We also have examples of cascades kind of fizzling out.
Yeah.
Are they likely to change post-constitutions? Well, there's a lot of talk these years in political science on democratic backsliding. In Martin's and my paper on coup cascades, we actually find the opposite. But that does not mean that coming from a democratic society, that cascading emergencies of one or the other kind might not lead to democratic backsliding. And from a purely economic point of view, are cascading emergencies more expensive? Again, we don't know. But all of these questions require empirics. They require that we somehow agree on a working definition of what a cascading emergency is. We somehow agree on a typology of cascading emergencies.
Okay, so here's a question.
Yeah.
In order to say something meaningful of cascading, it would be important for us to have a counter empirical data on recurring or repeating, right? So then you can say, are cascading more or less than repeating? Because let's assume that there is a vulnerability in society, the way we define vulnerability, not overall societal vulnerability, but a vulnerability in a system. And then the question is whether something is cascading versus whether something is repeating or recurring. Because we didn't fix the vulnerability, right? That's from a public choice theory, you have several ways to go about it. Once you say, okay, it's too expensive, or we have other priorities, or what have you, or I have political inability to deal with it, whatever it is, I leave the vulnerability as it is. Another possible is I try to reduce the vulnerability by some mitigation. So there are issues. Then the question is whether it matters that something is recurring or something is, in our terminology, spills over to another silo.
Another vulnerability.
And then triggers another silo that is
usually in the same vulnerability, okay?
And another silo that is built on other vulnerabilities.
Right.
Does that make a difference? Because from a public choice theory, again, from a political perspective, I get your point. So I'm hearing you. If I focus on fires or if I focus on terrorism, it means I don't focus on health issues or education or some other vulnerabilities I might have in my society. So the spillover effect to another vulnerability and therefore another silo versus just a recurring political instability or terror or fires, whatever. Does that make a difference? Can we study that? Can we code that?
We can. Let me just point out one older paper, Stefan. It's 2011, Berebi and Ostwald. What they found was that natural disasters tend to lead to terrorist attacks. So we would call that a cascading emergency, yes. Right?
Okay. Yes.
I want to stress that Stefan and I, when we actually came back to that question, did not find systematic evidence of that.
Okay.
But it seems to have been accepted as a fact in that literature. But we did not find that natural disasters are in any way causally associated with the likelihood of terrorist attacks.
Okay, so
that does not mean that it can't lead to other vulnerabilities or other emergencies for that matter, but it's just one example of the value of really very carefully coding these different types of events up in a joint data set.
So first of all, this is very helpful because again, if you want to study this spillover effect, we need to have your paper in mind as well. So, but we're just careful about causality. So we don't necessarily talk about causality. Correlation is good enough. So for causality, you have to have an explanation of what causes, and then this becomes sometimes very kind of...
So there could be a correlation between terrorist attacks and natural disasters, but can you prove causality?
No, I don't think. Yeah.
I don't think so. I didn't read the paper. But...
Yeah, so it's enough for us to talk about correlation from a public choice theory, then you can expect a correlation with that's good enough to inform the decision maker.
I don't think so.
If it's just
they should know about it. to expect.
But what can you do if you have a natural disaster and there's correlation with terrorism?
I'll tell you, you can at least tell the security establishment, be on higher alert. If you're not on higher alert, we know from October 7th what happens. So just on the safe side, the precautionary principle will kick in and say, look, we don't understand the causality. Maybe yes, maybe no. Just, you know what, to be on the safe side, at least that we can say. So in my book, that's good enough.
Fine.
But if Stefan and Christian will tell me, look, there's correlation, at least higher alert will be, I will take fewer chances.
It will probably work on a different vulnerability. I mean, that may occur.
That's fine. Okay.
And therefore, you have to understand which vulnerability.
Okay, good enough.
Close for another research.
Okay, good enough for me, but it's important. Okay, you got to go because it's your 2 minutes.
No, I'm good for the next 20 minutes. So go ahead. I mean, I'm sure Stefan has lots of things to do. He always has good ideas.
Maybe there are questions, remarks from other members here.
Please.
I have many things I want to say, but I'm thinking maybe we'll wait after Nadiv's presentation.
But they won't be online.
But maybe they can maybe start this presentation and listen.
Yeah.
No. You want to like 20 minutes.
Okay.
It's yours.
So I was thinking,
Okay.
yeah, but let's all try to be in the same conversation. So I was thinking, okay, maybe it's worth taking a step back and asking, what did we find interesting in this project? Why did we set up? And I think there were two main things. The first thing is that we looked at the COVID and we thought that something happened there, something different, something interesting, theoretically, practically, we should look at that. And the second thing that I think is interesting to everyone here is the liberal democracy crisis and democratic backslide. And I think between the lines, we've been trying for semester now, and particularly yesterday, work out how, what is basically an interpretive and narrative question of democratic crisis, how it fits in with the theory. And I'm thinking, after hearing your excellent presentation that brings out very complex theoretical questions about the framework and the way we define things. Maybe, and I'm saying it very carefully, maybe we should reverse our question and not to think how we come up with a framework can explain or cover every single crisis. And I'm speaking as an historian. I'm very happy to talk about the 50s and 60s and the 40s and Weimar. I teach that. But maybe we should look at it differently, because the characteristics of current crises in liberal democracies and of democratic backsliding are different. And maybe we should not try to come up with a framework that can cover every single crisis and long histories. And we saw it very clearly in the case studies yesterday, that people have been trying to present what we historians call long histories. And this is excellent. This is how we do historical studies. I'm not sure it can work here, or at least it can work without getting us into very, very complicated theoretical questions. Maybe we should look at it a bit differently and make our departure point democratic backsliding and the rule of law, and try to see how this fits theoretically with the framework of cascading emergency. That's my first point. It's an open question. Maybe it's worth talking about. Going back to the case studies of yesterday, you weren't with us most of the time, but the people were doing excellent historical case studies. And I was asking myself during the presentations, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to understand multiple crises or cascading crises in certain societies, or are we focusing on a particular moment in history where all the 30, 40 years of crises have coalesced into a particular moment, and then we're looking at this moment and we say, okay, we've reached that point. It doesn't matter how, we're not going to write the historiography of Sudan or Iraq or every other example here. And now we want to look at this particular moment and see what's happening here. How does it behave? How are the different components interact with each other? I don't know, but that's worth a thought as well. I don't think it's even feasible to do long histories of decades of different case studies and histories. I'm not sure they fit together. I'm sure that countries that are not liberal democracies, the questions are different, the structures are different, the things we're looking at are different. We should think about that as well. Another question that I was asking myself yesterday and today, and that might be a working hypothesis. Can we say that what we're seeing here is that societies or countries that have a long-standing ongoing crisis, and it can be an ethnic tension, like we saw in the Yugoslavia case. It can be a lack of constitution or the occupation in the Israeli case.
Poverty.
Is what we're looking, Brazil, yes, is what we're looking at is actually a situation where societies that have this kind of a long-standing crisis, and then something happens. It can be COVID-19, it can be an economic crisis, it can be something, a political crisis, a particular government, but something happens and it dwells with this long-standing situation. And then we see the phenomena that I think looking at. So that's another question, because I think this is a common denominator of many of the case studies that we have seen yesterday. Another thing I want to add to this very complex equation, and this is a question about measurement. How do we measure and how do we evaluate? And this is polarization. Polarization. In polarized countries, and this we know from research, we know that polarization is tightly linked to democracy and to the rule of law. We know that from research, from many studies. And what I want to ask is what happens in polarized society? And what happens, or how do we, as researchers, evaluate a situation where you have half the population looking at things as a democratic failure and almost a state failure, and half of the society is looking at it as a correction, something that needs to be fixed, as deep state, as all of the thing. How do we deal with that? How do we evaluate it? It's a question of narrative. How do we extract our discussion from this narrative question? And another question in this respect is, do we actually argue that from a certain point, polarization becomes a democratic crisis by definition? And this, I think, links are what we do here to one of the biggest research trends, as far as I know, currently taking place, especially in Europe, about the links of polarization with other phenomena. And I think this links. Am I being too long? Is that all right? 2 more brief points and I'm done.
So you're saying that polarization is a type of political instability or political vulnerability?
Yes.
Even bigger than that.
Even bigger than that.
Think
I'm
about
saying
polarization as climate.
And I'm also saying that
Why?
You should not. I mean,
Exactly.
I'm sorry, but we're being a little bit too fast, maybe, with the equivalencies between political conflict and disagreements amongst people about the structures that should govern their lives.
That's exactly what I'm arguing, that we are going into interpretations and narratives, and how do we extract our discussions from
we're
that?
utilizing the disaster literature and the disaster management cycle terminology and phases in order to make sense of what in other places in literature are calling path dependence. And historical unfolding events in ways that almost depoliticizes those conflicts. The Northern Ireland conflict, it is by all means a disaster. It wasn't resolved by, I don't know, increasing or managing the vulnerabilities of the Protestant government. It was settled by a peace agreement that attended to different groups' grievances. So utilizing this terminology in order to kind of downplay the politics of conflicts is a little bit dangerous and very much technical in ways that I don't think is helpful, not for this project and not for understanding divided societies. That's my view, and I'm sorry I cut you.
No, that wasn't my argument at all, and it's not about cutting. We're trying to have a conversation, and I think
it's just like the accumulation of the kind of metaphors that are being used to deal with political problems.
The danger in this project and its aspiration to include complex and global challenges is that we will stretch emergency conceptions to policy problems and situations which are not defined by emergencies or which are resolved by other political and social
exactly. And this is why I wanted
to take care
and I want to make
be cautious about
okay, I want to make a suggestion.
That's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. But definition wise, we need a way out. Otherwise, we're gonna get like a microcosmos of every political argument that happens internally in any given country. So maybe, and that's an open question, what we can do, and this is also measurable, that in any given situation where we see a measurable dispute over the functioning of fundamental institutions in a country, without interpretive question, we can say, okay, whenever this is
but then that's
apparent,
not focus on disasters.
Yeah. Okay, it's different. Let me finish the sentence, and then I think you know where I'm heading. In order to escape this problem and this problem, the problem that I mentioned before, we might be able to escape that by saying escaping subjective criteria, saying whenever we can see measurable significant disputes over the functioning of fundamental state and democratic institutions. This is a democratic crisis by definition, and we can, in our equation and the way we analyze cascading crisis, we consider it as one.
But then what do we do with it? So we say it's a crisis, but there's nothing to do because there's a dispute about...
Now you can ask the substantial question that you want to ask. What happens there? Do government take advantage of it? How do they manage the crisis? What happens when 2 or 3 or 4?
The disaster.
Maybe we should.
But we're not only in the domain of disasters.
So again, this is a project about disasters. We can say that we don't want to study disasters, but we want to study something else. Democratic backsliding or other things, that's okay.
But it's always in the background.
Yes, we're studying.
On democracy and democratic backsliding, it's very apparent in the presentation we just listened to. These are the found questions. So part of
I think that Christine and Stefan have to leave soon. So
yeah, maybe I don't know if this is helpful, but maybe a very simple suggestion. So as you know, economists are simple people, and summarizing what was just said by I don't know your name, the historian in the room. Yeah. So what was just said is, why don't you bring in either democratic backsliding or rule of law backsliding in a sense as a dependent variable? Okay. So what can be done are the following things. I mean, we can look at democratic backsliding. We can look at rule of law backsliding. We can do this across the countries. There are wonderful data about this. And we can ask to what degree the occurrence of emergency / cascading emergencies / multiple emergencies / complex emergencies, whatever, can explain directly or indirectly the degree of democratic backsliding or rule of law backsliding. And we can, to take up one of the terms, but not two, but take up one of the terms that was also mentioned in the intervention is, obviously we can do sort of a mediation analysis. We could ask to what degree cascading emergencies, in a sense, are an indicator for the weakness of government and can then lead to some sort of populist governments. Hey, these guys in DC or within the Beltway or whatever it is, they don't deliver, which could lead to have more populist movements, which could be analyzed to what degree, this mediation of cascading emergencies via an increase in population leads to a rule of law backsliding. So this is, an attempt to take up some of the ideas that were mentioned in the previous intervention. Christian, you want to add something?
Yeah, one of the reasons why we picked the Brazilian case is exactly that it begins with what some people would at that time claim was democratic backsliding. The reintroduction of presidentialism and Goulart's increasing argument that you need to concentrate power in order to get things done. And what it ends up causing is democratic backsliding in terms of a military dictatorship. But it's I think one of the great things about the Brazilian case is exactly that it illustrates how complex it is, because it starts with something that we would today code as democratic backsliding. Just two very brief comments too. On the long history, I've thought for a very long time, I know Stefan and I have thought about that, that the idea of doing long history is, in this case, is very, very helpful in order to try to understand why the emergency provisions of the Constitution end up looking like they do, because they differ very dramatically across countries and in ways that are not obvious. So they must come from somewhere. And I thought a long historical view of that would be very, very helpful. Now, last little bit about polarization. If you code up normal ways of polarization, you would code up Denmark the last 40 years or 45 years as highly politically polarized. I don't think anyone out in Europe would claim that my country is polarized. But if you're here or if you code up things, it looks highly polarized. So I think we need to be very, very careful about how we think about political polarization. We tend to think of it in US terms, but that is only a tiny bit of what polarization actually is.
Yeah. I want to add another point of the lawyer. That was the historian point. You focus on declaration of emergency.
Not necessarily.
No, there's studies that Christian and Stefan are doing are the independent variable is declaration of emergency.
That's a 150, right?
And I think that we have to broaden the picture, because the legal response to disaster or cascading disaster can be also legal changes which are not declaration of emergency. And can be also stepping outside the law, which is related directly to the question of the deterioration of the rule of law. And I think that a broader perspective or framework of the legal responses will tell us more about the connection between a single disaster and cascading disaster. And
yeah, may I respond, Eli, or? Well, Christian mentioned that already in passing. We have this paper in the Journal of Legal Studies where we look at what we refer to as unlawful or unconstitutional emergencies. So what we do is we look at three things. We look at, has the declaration of a state of emergency been within the confines of the law? Has the implementation of the state of emergency been within the confines of the Constitution? And has the end, there's in many constitutions, there's a maximum number of days or months. So has that been in line with the Constitution? So we've looked at that. Now, the interesting thing, and COVID was mentioned a minute ago, so what we are doing right now is we are analyzing the lawfulness or the unlawfulness of declarations of emergency under COVID, and there were very, very many. And the interesting and unexpected result that we find is that if you separate autocratic from democratic countries, then to our own surprise, the likelihood of seeing unlawful states of emergency declared due to COVID is higher under democratic countries. In a sense, this could also be an indication of the rule of law backsliding that is going on in democratic countries. So we have been looking at these issues, at least to a degree.
This is really interesting because we talked about Tom Ginsburg and Mila Verstig article, and they seem to tell us everything is okay in democracies, don't worry about it. And you have a different, this is very important for us because you have...
Actually, I can tell you just as a way of background, I was talking to Tom, or we were discussing whether we should have a paper together. And then we figured that he was very positive about what was going on, and we were rather critical, so we decided not to have the joint paper.
Yeah, no, this is very helpful.
Maybe change his mind.
Yeah, but I think
Stefan, what is in the gap between what you describe as illegitimate or unconstitutional declaration of emergencies and declaration of emergencies within the Constitution is legal changes which are not connected to declaration of emergency. For example, the COVID law that was enacted by our parliament and many other parliaments is a legal response within the constitutional order.
But it's highly problematic.
Which is not captured by
constitutional declaration.
Yeah. And I think that this is a missing link. And this is something that is measurable, you know, how much legislation is changed, what degree.
Itai is something.
Well, I told you economists are simple people, and I can only repeat that. I mean, I remember within the confines of the Minerva, we discussed this like 8 or 10 years ago, and one reason why we are sort of focusing and constraining ourselves to constitutions is that, well, you know, we know there are texts, we know how their texts change over time. If you want to, I mean, you talked about correlation and causation before. You want to, you know, if you try to establish any kind of causation to basically general lawmaking as a consequence of states of emergency or even broader related to emergencies, well, good luck. And that's that. You know, it's super complex. And yeah, you know, I don't know, Christian, maybe you are more optimistic than I am, but you know, I think it's, you know, it'll be close to impossible. Or you need like hundreds of research assistants, you know, coding all the legislative process that have been going on in the world. It'll be very, very cumbersome.
We have we have something about Itai. There's a network of people who try to code in each of their country.
Jeff King project.
The COVID-related legislation, only COVID-related legislation. The problem there is that you only have COVID. You cannot. You're limited to the COVID world, and you cannot have any non-COVID. They don't, because of the reason Stefan said. There's no non-COVID related because it's too much. I just want to repeat again. You have to go that it will be really helpful for us if you could include in your research what you call ongoing / repeating that is not necessarily cascading. That will really, if you have the data on that, it will be really helpful for us to see, you know, what is a measurement or a yardstick to a vulnerability that is not cascading, but nonetheless recurring, repeating, because then, you know, we can say something meaningful about that. When do we see you in Israel for the? We're planning.
A workshop in Germany.
A workshop in Germany could also have. We've done that also before. Maybe we're planning something in October.
We're going to talk about it.
So Hamburg or Denmark?
Denmark sounds good.
Hamburg, Denmark, or Israel in October. You know, let's.
October, Denmark might be. Yeah, a big issue.
Well, I mean, you're obviously most welcome. The institute has moved, so we have you know, even nicer premises than before. There's a direct flight. I was looking into joining you at this meeting, and there's a direct flight by Eurowings now, directly from Tel Aviv to Hamburg. So yeah, let me know what the ideas are, and then we see whether we can make it happen.
Okay, good.
And maybe Christian can even join. It's a 3-hour ride from Aarhus, where he is by car.
Yeah, 2 hours from where I live.
Okay, right.
Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And
Thank
we'll
you.
continue.
Okay. Bye-bye. All the best.